My staff is always on my case that when I give a talk, I should always say a little bit about the organization before I start, so I'm going to take about 1 minute to do that. The group that I represent is called CFACT, Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow. It's a mouthful, which is why we call it CFACT. We've been around since 1985. We are a group that works on environment, development, and energy issues from a free market perspective. A columnist for the Boston Globe one time called us, or described us as a Greenpeace of the right. And I would say that that's a kind of a fair description. We work on many of the same issues, but from a conservative perspective. Among the things we do, of course, we do our share of policy papers and reports. We testify before regulatory and legislative bodies. We also have some very interesting programs. One of them deals with students. We have collegians chapters around the country. These are where we try to motivate young people to get captured by our ideals, and that has been going around since about the year 2000. We have a information site on climate information called Climate Depot, headed by our very own Mark Morano. Mark, little known secret, used to be Rush's man in Washington when Rush Limbaugh had a show there. He called our site, Climate Depot, his favorite source of information other than himself. So we were very proud of that. We also put together movies. We just had one made with Kevin Sorbo called Climate Hustle 2. And we are proud that that was aired on Newsmax a couple times over the last couple of months. Our first movie, Climate Hustle 1, actually wound up being the #1 movie in America for one night. We beat out My Big Fat Greek Wedding 2 and Superman versus Batman. Okay, the competition wasn't that much, but we were still #1 for one night. And if you want to find out more, simply go to our website called CFACT, that's CFACT.org. Okay, I finished my shameless self-promotion, and now I'll get into my talk, which deals with ESG and the rise of woke capitalism. I don't know about you, but this is an issue that is capturing more and more media attention. I was just at an ALEC conference. Do any of you know what ALEC is? The American Legislative Exchange Council, right? This is where a bunch of legislators from the conservative libertarian perspective come together. They create model legislation. They do it each year. This year it was in Atlanta a couple weeks ago, along with people from some business associations and other conservative libertarian think tanks. I was urged by my good friend James Taylor from the Heartland Institute to join this a couple years ago, and tried to be a little bit of a stick in the mud, and we've done that. But one thing I noticed at this most recent meeting is that this subject was huge. They brought in, first and foremost, a very captivating speaker, a guy named Vivek Ramaswamy. Have any of you ever heard of this guy? Oh yeah, it's a shame you don't have him instead. You got me instead here talking about this. But anyway, captivated the audience. My other good friend Steve Malloy did a side workshop on this. It was packed, standing room only. In fact, ALEC revamped their whole schedule to put more stuff about this issue. It is, without question, a very hot topic. But you don't need to just go to public policy platforms or where a bunch of policy people are talking. The public gets it because they see it on their TV. All the commercials, you're wondering where they're coming from. You got Kaepernick, for example, right? This is a guy who basically was kicked off every team. He didn't really accomplish much, but he was picked up by Team Nike for the purposes of kneeling at the national anthem, and that made him a hot commodity as far as they were concerned, and they boldly post him on their commercials. You got BP talking about going net zero. Think about this. This is a company that deals in petroleum products, proud of the fact it's going to get rid of petroleum products down the road somewhere. Where did this come from? You also have the Impossible Burger, you know, these meatless burgers that people have. Have any of you even eaten one of these meatless burgers? Just out of curiosity. You know, they're designed to reduce greenhouse emissions. You know, they're made from beans. I myself, when I eat, I don't know. I think greenhouse gases kind of go up the more people eat these things. And then my favorite, this is an older one, the Nissan Leaf, where the guy, some electric car or something, is hugging a polar bear because it's so friendly. The question I have for you is, where does all this come from? Why are these companies doing this? There's been several options that have been given. One option is they're reacting to the consumer base. The grassroots wants it. You look at polling. Where does climate change rank on the level of issues of priority for the general public and voter preferences and everything? It's always dead last, right? The public's at least 50-50 divided on all these woke issues. There's a mass support for the Second Amendment, and other issues. That seems fishy to me. Other people surmise it's because all the corporate execs are all liberals, basically, and they're pushing this because they themselves want it. That may be true. We're going to get into who some of these individuals are. But another reason they're doing it is because of ESG criteria. You know how in a credit card system you guys want to make sure your credit is really good so you can maybe buy a house or get a car or anything. Well, these companies, in a similar way, want to make sure their ESG score is really high. And there's all sorts of benefits that happen with their shareholder value and just in general their ability to get loans and the like. Now, this is a complex issue. When I first told my compatriot Mark Morano that I was going to talk on this, he kind of put his hands in his face. Craig, you can't talk on this. This is like way too technical. It's out there. Everyone I've seen, it's like really hard to follow. And he's right. It kind of reminds me of the Gordian knot. When Alexander the Great went to Gordium in Turkey in about 333 BC, and he was told by a seer in that town, if you want to capture Asia, you got to figure out how to untangle this tough knot. And of course, he started to, and then figured out a real simple solution. He just chopped it, right? And he, of course, took over Asia. Well, in a similar way, I'm going to approach this very simply. I'm going to go who, what, when, where, why, and I didn't put on there how. All right? Although I'm already going to confuse it because I'm going to rearrange these. I'm going to do what, where, who, why, and how. A Baptist pastor once said to me, Craig, when you give a talk, do three things. Number one, tell people what you're going to tell them. Then tell them. And after you're all done, remind them what you just told them. So the what will be, what is ESG? Definitions. The where did this come from? The who is pushing it? Why are they pushing it? And how do we stop it? That Baptist pastor friend of mine also told me three other things. He said, Craig, when you give a talk, do three also very important things. Number one, start with an interesting or provocative beginning. I probably already failed at that. Number two, end with a spellbinding conclusion. And number three, put number one and number two as close together as possible. So I will try to do that. We got a lot of ground to cover, so I will start by what is ESG, basically. Go to anywhere and try and get a definition, one definition that is unifying as to what ESG is, and good luck trying to find it. Investopedia says ESG is the following. Environmental, social, and governance criteria are used to screen investments based on corporate policies and to encourage companies to act responsibly. Wow, is that nebulous? All right, you can go to Rebecca. A little bit more clarity is given here. He said ESG means using environmental, social, and governance factors to evaluate companies and countries on how far advanced they are with sustainability. Okay, still pretty nebulous, but at least we know it has something to do with sustainability. The best is from MSCI, and this is a firm that we'll get to later that is actually quite active in this, and the first one that actually really got involved in sustainable ESG criteria. They said at MSCI, we define ESG investing as a consideration of environmental, social, and governance factors alongside financial factors in the investment decision-making process. I think the bottom line is here, we got a broad swath. You can define ESG many different ways. It kind of reminds me of the old Humpty Dumpty thing in Alice in the Looking Glass. Remember this one? When I say a word, says Humpty Dumpty, it means just what I say, nothing more, nothing less. Alice responds by saying, the question is, can you make one word mean so many things? And in this case, that is kind of what they're doing. Now, broadly speaking, ESG covers environmental, social, and governance factors. The problem is there's hundreds, often even thousands of factors that can be considered in grading a company. A few of them under environmental might include carbon emissions, how well a company performs in energy efficiency, how well it does with waste management, whether it recycles or not, and deforestation and others. With social, it often has to do with the diversity of a workforce, what's its makeup in terms of ethnicity and gender decisions, I guess, and also things like whether it's unionized and how much does that company do to invest in the community. And of course, governance is how the company actually governs itself. How does its board of directors work? Is it a board of directors that's diverse and has, different, again, a mix of gender and gender identity people in it, or is it run by basically a bunch of white dudes that do everything? They could also look at how much the corporate people are paid, what their lobbying activities are, what sort of organizations are they giving money to. That is also considered that. Now, we just learned the definitions are myriad. The criterion used to determine whether a company's ESG are myriad and random. Now, to add confusion to it, there's also just a ton of different companies that rate other companies. Among the bigger ones are companies like the CDP, the Sustainability Standards Accounting Board, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the UN Principle for Responsible Investment, World Economic Forum, Stakeholder Capitalism, Metrics. You also have Bloomberg's thrown in there. There are just lots of different companies doing this. So how am I doing, Mark? Did I make things really much less confusing so far? Even foreign countries have their own metrics. Take, for example, China. They proudly boast that their companies give out 85% data on whether they are achieving ESG standards. Of course, only about 10% of them are audited, but that's good enough for a lot of people in the West. They're very happy with China's way it rates itself. Now, once you're rated, you usually get a scorecard. By the way, these scorecards are also myriad. That's just some of them almost take an interpreter to try to figure out. But this would be an example of an easy one that's given out. And I won't disclose what company it is because I'm not sure entirely. But if you look at this, they'll have under their governance criteria here, be diverse and inclusive. And in this particular scoring, this company who's doing this believes that a company should have at least 30% of its workforce be women on the board, or women should comprise at least 30% of the board. This company did well. It had 36% in 2019 and 42% in 2021. It also should have a percentage of directors that voluntarily self-identify as a viable minority, a person of indigenous or aboriginal heritage, LGBTQ, or a person with a disability. I apparently didn't do very well in 2019. They wouldn't even give their data, or they didn't have it. But they did get above the 30%, 31% in 2020. But that would be an example of the type of scorecard you would get. You would also see underneath that the stuff on environment mostly has to do with climate change, but it could be any number of things. Now, because they're so all over the place, and the craziness of that, you'll get often very bizarre results. A case in point is Elon Musk, who, of course, runs Tesla, and he said in a tweet not long ago that Exxon is rated top 10 best in the world for environments and social governance, ESG, by S&P 500, while Tesla didn't make the list. ESG is a scam and has been weaponized by phony social justice warriors. He's right. He's right. But he's not seeing the whole picture. And I'll tell you why he got kicked. On the one hand, Elon Musk, think about it. He's going against Exxon. Exxon is Darth Vader, right? They have dirty fossil fuels. They're the problem with the world. Tesla makes electric vehicles, right? That's the light of the world. Why in the world would an electric company, electric vehicle manufacturer score lower than a fossil fuel company? Because ESG is not just environmental, where Tesla did beat Exxon. It's also social and governance. The two things he got nabbed on, number one, during the COVID lockdowns, he didn't lock down. His employees went to work, and it was reported a few of them got COVID. They survived, but they got COVID. Another thing he did was he went and he did not allow his employees to unionize. Another no-no in the world. Finally, a third thing he got gigged for is that he runs it as with an iron fist. Again, he's a white dude running his board of directors. He's not inclusive on his board like Exxon is. Hence, he gets an average ESG score versus a fossil fuel company. Kind of reminds me, you guys remember Rush Limbaugh used to do the environmental wacko picks for football teams? Nah, nobody remembers that, but it would be kind of funny. It would be similar. All right, why is this important? Why should anybody care? Well, they should care because 91% of banks monitor ESG, along with 24 global credit rating agencies. 71% of fixed income investors and over 90% of insurers look at these things. ESG considerations have driven some insurers to limit coverage of investments in certain sectors, and 67% of banks screen their loan portfolios for ESG risks. A good way to look at it was actually put by Simply Sustainable UK, a little bit of a long quote, but the consequence of a poor rating can be significant. If, for instance, your company were to receive a poor rating from one ESG data provider, your stock may be considered, quote unquote, an unsustainable asset by investors and excluded from their investment portfolio. If multiple investors follow this reasoning, this can eventually negatively impact your stock price. One thing's for sure, companies want to have an ESG score and they want it to be good. Assets in ESG, or the growth of ESG global assets, has skyrocketed. In 2016, it was about 22.8 billion. Today it's 22.8 trillion. Today it's 41 trillion, or projected to go there by the end of the year. To put that in perspective, that yellow line there is the US GDP. So they're talking a lot of money, a lot of power. All right, that is what is ESG. Now we're going to go into where did ESG originate? How am I on time? Lots of time. What, I got 2 hours, 3 hours? Okay, just checking. Where did ESG originate? The timeline. All right, I'm going to give you a classic timeline. I have an issue with this timeline, but this is the one that is often spewed out by advocates of ESG, where they'll say, if you want to understand where it's coming from, here's the timeline. I'll give you another timeline later in this that's a little more succinct, but it'll give you an idea of where I would say the timeline actually originated. But if you want to get what is the status quo is a discussion of it, this is what people will say. All right, first question. Does anybody know, or can anyone pick out, where did ESG originate? Any ideas? Thoughts? What's that? That's a good guess. Wrong. But I'm joking. Women. No. But we are going to address women in this part. China's a good guess. How about in history, any particular time frame? Yeah, founding in 72? No. Actually, the source of ESG is God. This is what they'll say. Why do I say? Well, it's not quite God, but it has Christian roots, is what they're saying. And they go back to John Wesley, the founder of Methodism. Oh, isn't that nice? I mean, these are liberals, of course, who don't really have much good to say about any person of faith, saying that ESG started with him. What John Wesley taught, and what is commonly taught in churches today, is that your money is a gift from God, and you should not use it to go to the gambling casinos in Vegas. No. He would say, don't use it, to things for drinking and smoking and pornography, whatever else it is. And you should use it to promote good. Now, the Quakers picked this up, And they used it to go against the slave trade early on around the time of colonial America. This guy, Anthony Benezet, said without purchasers, referring to the slaves, he argued there would be no trade, and consequently every purchaser, as he encourages a trade, becomes partaker in the guilt of it. This other gentleman, Benjamin Lay, was actually friends with Benjamin Franklin. He lived outside Philadelphia. He wouldn't actually wear any clothes made from slaves. He made his own clothes, so he looked kind of haggard. He lived as a vegetarian out in the countryside because he wouldn't eat any food that was made by slaves, and actually lived in a cave. He used to take his writings to Benjamin Franklin, who dutifully published them, and he became kind of a fixture in the early part of colonial America. What you'll notice, though, with this is that it was kind of a grassroots up effort to try and promote what they called socially responsible investing. Now, over time, that socially responsible investing changed tenor. It started to go with two things that kind of went concurrent. One was the temperance movement, and the other was the woman's right to vote. So when you said it started with women, you weren't far off on that one. They will often cite this particular movement because of the fact that the women's movement was very much into trying to shut down all the liquor stores. In fact, the two kind of came at the same time. The 18th and 19th Amendment came in about 1919, one right after the other. And you would often see wagons like this: help us, meaning there's a band full of women, give us the right to vote, and we'll close the saloon. All right? They even got pretty important. They really stressed this when they would say, our lips will not kiss, shall not touch, lips that touch liquor shall not touch our lips. So given that sort of pressure, it kind of came down to women, liquor, women, liquor. Men gave in. 1919, they gave the right to vote to women, and they closed the saloon. Well, that lasted, for about 14 years. Then the 21st Amendment came in. Women retained the right to vote, but they moved on and got that. All right, next up, and again, this was a grassroots up movement. We have the social movement in the Vietnam War. So we fast forward to that time frame. And this time you saw activism against specific companies. In particular, Monsanto for its development of Agent Orange, also Dow for the development of napalm. And you saw a lot of the hippie protesters back then going against these companies rather directly. This was followed in a more serious way when it came to the apartheid issue in South Africa, where intense grassroots pressure was placed on companies to divest from doing any business in South Africa. Now, here's gets interesting. This is the first instance where really they went after shareholders. You had what they call corporate social responsibility being pushed. That is the idea that companies need to do what's responsible by not investing in the Vietnam War, by not investing in apartheid, and urging shareholders to start applying pressure to companies to change their behavior. For South Africa, they also pushed to have companies have what they called the Sullivan Principles. And these were voluntary agreement, and you'll see how this template of pressuring shareholders, getting companies to sign petitions would take root within about 20 years after this in a more aggressive way. Basically, the Sullivan Principles really emphasize that we would be fair in our workforce among people who are of different, blacks and whites would be treated the same. At this time, you had a rather radical transition also occurring in the financial shareholder world. Milton Friedman, who talked about stakeholder capitalism, that was really what most people believed. The idea was that a corporate head, it wasn't his money. He was taking money from shareholders, and he ought to invest it as the shareholders would like him to do, not to put it into causes that he necessarily thought were just wonderful and peachy. And what was the cause most shareholders wanted? To make money, get a good return on their dollar, so long as it's done legally and ethically. All right, now at this time in academia, and what has become kind of commonplace in our era is something called shareholder capitalism. I quote this thing from the Economics Foundation that kind of describes it, and you'll see how earning money is just simply not enough for shareholders, that companies should be explicitly accountable to a mission and a set of interests beyond shareholder returns. Equally, investment must provide long-term capital for socially and environmentally useful projects, and damaging forms of speculation must be restricted. So now shareholders should not, companies should no longer be concerned about profit and gross things like that and giving their shareholders a good return. They need to care about the environment, climate change, protecting the rainforest, et cetera, et cetera. This is when this took place, started to take place, was in the 80s. Now we move to the 90s. And this is where I actually think the timeline kind of really begins. The left, having seen the success of, the Quakers back in the day, and having seen the success of the women's suffrage movement and the temperance movement and the Vietnam War and the South Africa case, seeing that these grassroots movements had accomplished some things, said, I like this. We need a better cause, though. I mean, freeing slaves is okay, but we have a better one: sustainable development. I say that tongue-in-cheek, seriously. But sustainable development came into vogue not from the grassroots up. This is the former president of Norway, who actually bonded with the UN and other academics from LI, the hoity-toity. They created this book called Our Common Future, and they coined the phrase sustainable development, which means development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. This would come into force in greater detail after the 1992 Earth Summit, and in particular with a document called Agenda 21. Now, every time I mention Agenda 21, maybe not here, but people look at me as though I have a tinfoil hat on my head and a propeller bouncing around. I always point them to Amazon. You can go to Amazon and just buy your own copy. But basically, what Agenda 21 does, as many of you know, is it takes different sectors of our economy, transportation, energy, you name it, and it shows how sustainable development applies in each of these areas. Of course, these have been whittled down to the 17 sustainable development principles after the Millennium Goals and the future we want in South Africa in 2012 and as part of Agenda 2030. Also at this time, the MSCI, which was originally the Domini 400 Social Index, emerged. This was the first effort to actually create a firm that judged companies based on sustainable development criterion. Wasn't called ESG at that point. Now by the way, this hasn't done exactly well either. To show you how committed they are to shareholder capitalism, returns, what's returns? Right prior to COVID, the MSCI actually got about, a 22.3% return? That's pretty good. But not when the S&P 500 is scoring at 42.6. So it got only half the return. But the important thing isn't whether you're getting a good return, it's whether you feel good. All right, last phase of this is the more modern era. Again, in stark contrast to the Quakers and everybody else, Kofi Annan in 2005 invited a bunch of people, 50 of the world's top business leaders, to a meeting to create something called the Principles for Responsible Investment. These are both a set of principles and actually an organization. The organization is a 20-person investor group drawn from institutions in 12 countries. It aligns business operations from those who sign its principles with accepted principles in the area of human rights, labor, environmental, and support for UN goals. And it also is supported by a 70-person group of far-left NGOs. The principles that they want to sign are these ones. Essentially, I won't go through all of them. It basically says if we sign this, we're going to make ESG the way we do business. Now, just like with climate change, the UN realized there may be legal issues with this. All right, just like with climate change, they want to get the science right. And they created the IPCC to make sure everything was done correctly. Well, they did the same here. They hired a very expensive firm in 2006 to look into this. London's law firm, Freshfields, Bruckhaus, Derringer, I think that goes back to the 1800s. And they charged them with this question because they didn't know the answer to this. They just wanted to find out what the case was. They said, is the integration of ESG issues into the investment policy voluntary permitted, legally required, or hampered by law and regulation? They didn't know the answer. Well, to their shock, they came back, the London law firm, and said, yes, what you're doing with these principles, absolutely legal. In fact, integrating ESG considerations into investment is clearly permissible and arguably required in all jurisdictions around the world. It took off. PRI is now, signed by 7,000 corporate signatures, pretty much everybody on the S&P 500, and is the world's largest voluntary corporate sustainability initiative. Okay, so that completes our timeline there. In my opinion, the important thing to take away from this timeline, and I'm glad you hung with me through kind of a history lesson here, is I have a hard time grappling that the guy living in a cave, protesting, slavery, is in any way similar to 50 of the richest business people in the world coming together. Does not one seem like it's kind of grassroots up and the other one kind of top down? I just, throw that out there. All right. So now we did the what is ESG? Where did it come from? Now we're going to do who. Now when I did this section, I thought of mafioso people. I don't know why I did, but it just went through my head. So I'm going to start with the big three asset managers. And these guys went through my head. These are paintings. Can anybody name to me any one of these three characters? No, I want their real names. Who? No. Who was that? Who's actually the picture there? It's not Fink. Capone is one. Anybody else? Yes, Lucky Luciano, exact. And the last one? No. I'll give you his first name, Frank. Okay. Yes, Frank Costello. All right. Well, as you are right, you guys actually got it there. I actually am going to rebrand them as BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. No discussion of ESG can take place unless you look at those three. Why are they so big? Well, the average investor ownership of the big three in the S&P 500 back in '98 was about 5.2%. That's impressive. But by 2017, it grew to 20.5%. And the big three today cast 25% of the votes of the S&P 500 companies. And they're on pace to grow that to about 40% by the year 2040. Wow, that's serious. Glenn Beck put it this way. If that were to occur and they actually get that much by 2040, three Wall Street firms working in conjunction with a relatively small group of other shareholders could effectively control all of corporate America. All right, the first guy who I put as Capone, I don't know how many of you saw the baseball bat thing. He used to have these dinners and pick out some unlucky guy and bash his head while everybody just continues eating. Anyway, to me, they're the big one. Last year, BlackRock voted against or withheld votes from 4,800 directors at 2,700 different companies. They said this in their annual report, where we feel companies and boards are not producing effective sustainability disclosures or implementing frameworks for managing these issues, we will hold board members accountable. And they do. They do on this side of the world. They don't so much, actually, in other sides of the world, as we'll check that later. Now, the other guy who puts people in the concrete boots is, Vanguard, right? They're very committed also to ESG principles. In fact, just recently, a private pensions operator, a gun manufacturer, and Rupert Murdoch's media groups are among a number of stocks that have been thrown out of Vanguard funds created to invest in companies with strong environmental, social, and government record. All right. State Street, they have a thing for the ladies. State Street says it will vote against the entire slate of board members on the nominating committee of any company not meeting its gender diversity criteria. just by issuing that threat. They say more than 300 companies added a female director in response to its demands, and another 28 have pledged to do so. They are so in on the woman's right kind of feminist agenda that they even put up this. Anybody know what that is? Fearless Girl. That's in front of the Wall Street Bowl, right in front of, New York Stock Exchange. All right? That's how we're going to get back to that story in just a little bit. Have these groups ever colluded? Absolutely. I was actually on a call with them, as I think James Taylor's group from Heartland was as well, when they expunged 3 board members from Exxon. They colluded with a group called Engine One to get rid of some people that they didn't like, and they succeeded. 3 board members removed just to make a point. Now, I can't count, that's for sure. I got 9 up there, but there are 10 of them that are supposed to be up there. These big 3, Vanguard, BlackRock, and State Street, aren't alone. If you were to add up JP Morgan and some of their cohorts that they work with, you're talking real influence. Consumer spending, what, $12 trillion in the U.S., our U.S. GDP is about $21 trillion. These big 10 control assets of $34 trillion. Okay, they don't act alone. Now we got to look at some individual ESG thugs and players. Keeping with the mob theme, we'll start with our first one, which is Larry Fink of BlackRock. Larry is runs the world's largest management firm since 2009. He's rated the 28th most powerful person on the earth by Forbes magazine. He helped bail out the federal government, both in 2008 and during the coronavirus. He was turned to by Obama and even Trump to help out with some of the economic conditions existing in both those quote-unquote crises. How committed to ESG is he? He says, well, we believe that sustainability should be our new standard of investing. And of those issues, climate change is he's most passionate about. He says climate change has become a defining factor in a company's long-term prospects. Every company in every industry will be transformed by the transition to a net zero world. The question is, will you lead or will you be led? Of course, his most adamant thing he's in is moving to China. He loves China. BlackRock is all about investing in China. In fact, he can't get enough of China, and he says this every year in his annual stakeholders meetings, that he says, we need to do more business in China. So, ESG in China? Uyghur labor? What sort of human rights violations? No problem. Okay, a second one of these guys, Michael Bloomberg. All right. Bloomberg, of course, former mayor of New York City. This guy's worth over $60 billion. Put in comparison to the guy, the first one I mentioned, Larry Fink. Larry Fink has $1 billion. He's a pauper comparatively. Anyway, this guy is extremely committed to ESG. Not just that he gives so much money and he has his own way that he rates all the company. I think he has the biggest rating system for companies that's utilized in the world. But he came to the defense of Fearless Girl. You see, Fearless Girl came under attack shortly after she went up. An immigrant named Arturo di Modica. This guy, I think, came from Eastern Europe, suffered under communism. When he came to the country, he was very proud of the bull that he made. He made the bull that's in front of the New York Stock Exchange. And he built it to signify greatness. He loved capitalism. And this is positive outlook in America, onward, upward in the future. Well, when they put Fearless Girl in front of it, he said, that changed everything. That's a totally different message. That wasn't in the contract with me. I was given the right to do it if I did it my way, and they put this stupid statue in front, and now it's taken away from it. Well, of course, the creator of Fearless Girl, Kristen Visbal, she was upset. And so was Mayor Bloomberg. He tweeted out this. He said, men who don't like women taking up space are exactly why we need Fearless Girl. So he flew to the rescue and saved it. Third one is Mark Benioff. He's with Salesforce. He's so involved in in doing stuff for ESG that when Indiana and Georgia we're going to pass laws to protect Christian businesses. He said Salesforce will pull out all their money in those states unless they veto those laws, and the governor of Georgia actually vetoed it. He also similarly recently offered to pay for all the people in Texas who are on the Salesforce team to leave the state after Roe v. Wade was overturned by the Supreme Court. So this guy's committed, but not doing business in China. He has a big, very lucrative arrangement with Alibaba, and the two of them make wonderful music together. Last one is actually a woman, Lauren Powell Jobs, and she is woman, hear her roar. She is a very wealthy woman among them all, and that is one of her big passions. Of course, she got there in a very feminist way by marrying on to a guy much like, she was a big donor to Hillary Clinton, and they both rose to power using similar means. Latched onto some men that were going somewhere and wrote it. In her case, after her Jobs died, she became the second largest shareholder of Disney, and she ranks today as 59th on the Forbes list of world billionaires, and she gives away tons of money to woke ESG causes. Among them is $3.5 billion to a climate fund initiative, and also, though she's the biggest shareholder in Apple, she doesn't really seem to raise any questions when reports come out that Apple is using Uyghur labor, slave labor, to make their products. So these four are four that you should be aware of. I'll go through some other hitmen really rapid fire. One of them are banks like Bank of America. I would say the Sustainability Standards Accounting Board, CalPERS, which is a retirement system for California, the WEF, of course, the United Nations, which is actually promoting a sustainable stock exchange in addition to the PRI, and the SEC, which recently wants to regulate carbon emissions and make that a material issue for shareholders. All right, now I get to the meat of it. Why is this occurring? I'm going to come up with 3 different theories because I've read 3 different books. I'd recommend you read all 3 of them if you ever get a chance. We got one called Woke Capitalism that presents, it's by Carl Rhodes, which is kind of a left view that explains why this is happening. You have a right view by Stephen Sukup called Dictatorship of Woke Capital. And then what you'll have is what I call a power elite view. Okay, I'll start with the left view. Why are these people doing what they're doing? Well, if you're a leftist, you love Karl Marx. You may wonder why the left has anything to say on this. And Karl Marx basically says the definition of communism is to do away with private property. All this bit about shareholders and stock exchanges, why would a leftist care about it? And of course, people like Mao say that eventually capitalism will be replaced by socialism. You won't even have stock exchanges or private companies. So why would they be getting all worked up about this? Their spokesmen have been very critical of woke capitalism, even though they're avowed very far to the left people. Angela Davis, Bernie Sanders, New York Times applauding Marx's 200th birthday, saying he was right. Okay, so given that they hate capitalism, and we see this in their protests, from Occupy Wall Street, to Black Lives Matter, to climate protests, what does a leftist say when the companies start doing what they're asking them to do? They think it's killing the planet. Well, BP comes out and says we're for net zero. You got Fearless Girl out there, and you got Kaepernick for Black Lives Matter. So you would think those on the left would applaud this. But they don't. As Carl Rhodes says, this might all seem like a utopian vision of a new form of quote-unquote loving capitalism, but woke capitalism, although dressed in progressive street clothing, remains fundamentally wedded to the long-term corporate interests. He says the real effects of woke capitalism is not about the success of left activism in gaining support from big business. They are about ensuring there is no fundamental reform of the dominant neoliberal capitalist world that has exacerbated inequality, fueled fascist populism like Trump, and stood by as a climate crisis escalates. They're not buying any of it. They think that capitalism is in its dying grasps, and before it dies, they're going out there trying to sell themselves as progressives. They're wolves in sheep's clothing. And so you'll see the left out there complaining of greenwashing. Companies are just selling you a bunch of nonsense. All right? And you'll see them in the paper, whether it's Oafley or Shell Oil or McDonald's, which they've called McGreenwash. They're out there protesting these companies, saying this is all a big corporate, again, corporations just selling themselves when they don't really mean it. All right, the right view. This is a view that basically embraces corporate America, Wall Street, and everything. We have our champions, both in people like, Adam Smith and Milton Friedman. And, of course, we have our spokesmen who have always defended it. So when they look out and they see these types of advertisements that are to the left, they got concern. What do they see? They see that the people who are pushing it are all a bunch of leftists. They also show that these companies have already taken over mainstream media, our classrooms, Hollywood, social media, and they think Wall Street is all that remains, and they are going to try to stop it from taking over Wall Street. According to Steven Sukup, excellent book, Dictator of State, Woke Capitalism, he says, woke capitalism is the effort of the political left to harness the power of business and especially capital markets to advance overtly and exclusively political ends. He has his own timeline. He says that the timeline that I gave with you earlier is a bunch of nonsense. It all started with Woodrow Wilson, went through the Reserve, cultural Marxism through Gramsci, the Frankfurt School, the Principles for Responsible Development. This was all something that the left had plotted for a long time. And he says the transformation of Wall Street was no accident. It was a product of a long and careful process, a march through the various institutions, turning them on their heads until the titans of capitalism had been fully convinced that their surrender to the culture was not merely inevitable, but constituted the only moral legitimate path. So how do we explain businesses capitulating? Well, businesses are going woke as a strategic decision to appease those who would otherwise destroy them. It is a fiscal stay out of execution from the profit-killing acts of the activist left. Last one, because I'm running out of time here. I'll call this the power elite view. This one is presented by Glenn Beck. And he says that both the left and the right views are wrong. The Great Reset is not socialism. It isn't free market economics. The most accurate name is probably something like modern corporate cronyist techno-socialistic international fascism. In his view, he thinks it's not capitalism trying to save itself, which is a left view, or the fact that the socialists are going to take over, the right view. He says it's a war between the haves and the have-nots. He particularly takes aim at the World Economic Forum in his book on the Great Reset, where you have kind of a convergence of both business and government to form a new way of doing business. Of course, he puts into Klaus Schwab this whole thing of the Great Reset. To achieve a better outcome, the world must act jointly and swiftly to revamp all aspects of our societies and economies. In short, we need a great reset of capitalism. So what we're seeing with this is that great reset of capitalism. In this great reset, he says, you'll notice that you have the haves that meet in Davos, who have the wine and the cheese, they take the private jets, they have the limos, and they get criticized for it. But what they have in store for you and I is, we'll own nothing and we'll be happy. Big fish will eat little fish. He points to the COVID lockdowns as a template for what's coming in store. And you saw Amazon eat up all its competition from lockdowns, and the UN and the Pfizer given exemptions that they shouldn't have been given. And as a result of that, this great reset is going to be the ultimate conclusion of how the big guy, almost in a feudalistic system way, how the nobility trample down the poor. So those are the three main aspects, and kind of completes my talk for the most part here. I should share this. This is an interesting quote he ends his book with. He says, as strange as it may sound, Beck said, I could soon find myself fighting along the supporters of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders, who have repeatedly signaled their skepticism of elite groups like those working at Davos to produce the Great Reset. So which is it, baby? Actually, that concludes what I have. I got a few minutes, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. What do you think is driving this? I have my own impression, but I figured I'd save that.
Craig, we know that Biden campaign, we're going to get rid of all fossil fuels. Now, ESG principles, much of it is divesting in fossil fuels.
Yep.
We also know that crude oil was totally useless unless it's manufactured into something usable, the products and the fuels that society demands.
Yep.
Now, ESG is restricting crude oil into refineries, the feedstock. They're affecting investments in refineries. Refineries are closing, but the demand keeps increasing. So if you're tinkering with the supply chain into the downstream refineries to meet an ever-growing demand, are we guaranteed shortages and inflation in perpetuity?
You're using far too much logic. Remember the shareholder versus stakeholder. It's not about whether you make a lot of money, things run efficiently or that. It's about the feeling, are you making a better planet? So all these inefficiencies are okay, so long as,
but the bulk
we have
of
a more
society,
diverse workforce. Yeah, it may shut down, but we got too many people anyway on the planet.
right, the bulk of society will suffer.
Go ahead.
Our state treasurer in West Virginia, Riley Moore, is turning the tables on ESG. He just last month banned all banks that are doing ESG from any financial relationship with the state of West Virginia. How many more can we get people to fight back like that and turn the tables and shut them down?
Actually, you lead very well into my talk here. I said that actually, in order to fight back, there are laws in various states. I was talking with James Taylor right before this talk. We were trying to count how many. Did we ever get an amount, James, as to how many states have passed laws to restrict ESG? It's a handful. It's probably at least 5 that have done so, and we work in that as well, and I'm very inspired by it, but that is one of the ways that we can absolutely put the crimps on this.
Yeah, very, very good presentation. The Center for Financial Reporting and Management at Berkeley at the Haas Business School devoted a whole conference to ESG, which I really enjoyed. I had some trepidation about it, but I must tell you folks that I'm rather gratified to say the SEC commissioner who was there was against it. I'd say 40% of the speakers were against it. There were 60%, including people from Salesforce, who were good advocates. So hopefully you'll see that there is some debate in academia, and of course BlackRock was fined by the SEC for producing misleading ESG.
And Larry Fink also has rolled back some of his acceptance of it in recent statements. Whether that'll bear fruit or not, or he's just snowing us, we'll find out.
And what I might suggest for you, and perhaps for folks in this area, is academically, share price is well explained by fundamental accounting information. So it's hard to get that ahead of time. So do you have any studies that show that ESG will produce better results in terms of its correlation to share price than fundamental accounting? So
by the way, that's what Vivek Ramaswamy's all big on. He's actually, his whole point at the meeting is he thinks, and he's even opening up a company right now to challenge them on that, which is the idea of going back. Remember I mentioned a stakeholder versus shareholder? He thinks the solution is to return back to stakeholder capitalism, where businesses are in the business of making money.
As people know, there's a lot of scholarship activity to try and show that ESG adds value, but I just don't, I think you can always ask that question, and I don't think you're going to see that it's going to beat fundamental accounting information. So the observations I made there is because the debate is over, what is a legitimate, proper index of ESG performance? I mean, that's what's taking so much time and effort, and that's why the SEC is held up on things. I said, look, it's very simple. You can do what we did in the Climate Action Plan in my city. You report what is your GHG? What is the change in GHG from any policies you have undertaken or will undertake? Then you show that as a percentage of the local, state, national, and world GHG emissions. And the last thing is, just like in California, you're required to quantify the cost of mitigation per metric ton. And when you do that, you see what the cost is of this enterprise, include the cost of all the consultants, and when you see that the cost of mitigation is $100, $1,000, $10,000 per metric ton, and it's on a financial report, well, that is a fundamental disclosure. No one does that. We did it, in our climate action plan. And I think everyone here, that is the most fundamental, it's easily obtainable information, and it's very illuminating.
No, thank you.
Would you care to comment on any connection between Bilderberger's World Economic Forum, big fish eating little fish?
All right. Well, beyond what I just said there, I guess only in this regard is, and I actually don't want to steal any thunder from Mark Morano, who will be talking tonight. I do think ESG, the topic I'm talking about, is just a portion of a broader overall assault on things. Now, according to Klaus, it's the second pillar of the Great Reset. That means there's two more pillars. I don't know if Mark's going to get into that tonight or not, but I do think that there is a restructuring. In their own words, it's not me saying it. They're saying they want to restructure. They want a fourth industrial revolution or something like that they want to create. And they're claiming COVID is a template of this. So I guess if you like masks and lockdowns, we got a little bit of an inkling of what they're going to do based on their own words.
Hey, Craig, great job, as always. Earlier today, Joseph Limecooler pointed out that his company has to justify ESG scorecard criteria, and that's common throughout the industry. You point out that 70+% of financial companies require ESG, meeting their standards, 90+% of insurers. It illustrates that there is an opportunity for the financial industry, for the insurance industry, to make a great deal of money that they are passing up on. Can you talk about the necessary role of the collusion that goes on among these large companies? Otherwise, they would be losing out to competition. But that collusion, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. As a matter of fact, there have been numerous studies done. I think the guy who's written most on this is Rupert Darwall. I don't know if you guys know who he is, but he's followed this. And if you go to Real Clear Energy and look up his report, he has information that shows that ESG has not proven to be, companies are neglecting their fiduciary responsibility to their clients, and investment firms and asset managers are doing the same thing by going this route, but they're willing to do it anyway. Because profit making is not their primary interest. In order for that to be the case, though, they all have to be on board, because it would not work if one company as big as BlackRock said, we're not going to do it. And let Vanguard and State, because everybody would go to BlackRock, right? It requires a collusion on their part to do it. And as a result of that, it is troubling. I do think there are some things that are going to stand in the way of this. If we get somebody like a Vivek Ramaswamy who creates something that competes with it, even on a small level, usually there are fissures and cracks in these things that develop over time. Another big one is China. Obviously, they're exempt from everything, and that presents a black eye to these guys, because for all they're talking about environmental, social justice things, by exempting China from any of that criteria and China getting richer, it's going to become even more obvious just how quackamamie ESG is. So I don't know if I answered your questions entirely on that, James, but that's my rant for the moment. How are we on time?
Yeah, we're just about right at the time. So.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Just a couple more things here, because I didn't do this. It'll only take just a second. Last thing, how to fight back. Laws in various states. Educate yourself and share. Support freedom, pro-freedom groups. I would include, the Heartland Institute, Deweese's outfit there, the American Policy Center, ours at CFAC, but there are others. I would say buy from small businesses. You don't have to buy everything from Amazon. And last, vote for freedom candidates. Now I conclude.